Good evening, everyone. We ask that you kindly take your seats. The Australian Museum invites Yvonne Weldon to the stage to deliver the Welcome to Country.
Good evening, everyone. As was said, my name is Yvonne Weldon. I am a Wiradjuri woman from Cowra, here in New South Wales. My ancestors and I have a continual connection to the lands and the waters of the Clare, which later became known as the Lachlan, and of the Murrumbidgee rivers. I am elected Deputy Chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who are the culture authority under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act for the land we're on. I would like to pay my respects to all elders past and present, to all First Nations, to you and the ancestors' lands that you've travelled from. We're meeting here on Eora country. The boundaries of our traditional owners are embedded into the Earth's natural landscapes. The Eora Nation's boundaries are the Hawkes River in the north, the Nepean in the west, and the Georges River in the south. My people, the Aboriginal people, have been a part of this land for more than 65,000 years. We are the oldest living culture of the world. And wherever you venture across our beautiful country, understand you're entering the lands of nations, tribes and clans. We existed before all written words and all history, and it continues here today. On behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, the elders and the members, I welcome everyone to the land of the Gadigal. I acknowledge Gadigal people whose spirits and ancestors will always remain with this land, our Mother Earth. Aboriginal people are inclusive of all from these lands where we have hundreds of nations from this continent and also from across the globe, where the sharing and the trading of our resources, our knowledge and our traditions has been my people's way of life since time began. We traded for necessity and not for empires. Just as we are trading, or rather as we are sharing here tonight, not just in your space, your work, but in all parts of our lives, our world. We don't live in isolation of the land, the elements, the animals, the waters, and our environment. It is all part of us. It is a cycle of life, both here, now, and life before we came here. It will remain, we hope, long after. This cycle is how we keep in balance with the world around us, and we need to honour it. We should never take more than we need and return more than we have taken. Just as some give life or share life with others, be that humans or animals, our offering of our spirit of self is a gift. If we honour each other in line and in balance with our spirit and caring for the world around us, we can leave a better world beyond us, for others in turn, for generations and generations. All of us together can bring about positive changes to multiple generations, from our ancient still relevant world into our digital contemporary one, bringing my people, your people, and all our people together. It is Reconciliation Week with the theme, Be a Voice for Generations. And I've reflected about last year's theme as well, Be Brave, Make Change. Think about the difference you are and can make today, and what positive changes we all should make later in this year that will become the milestones of our future, all our futures. To make that future possible, let us all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey. May my people's spirits walk with you and guide you as we strive forward for us all. Again, on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, welcome to Gadigal land. This always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.
The hugeness of the reef, the incredible variety of its life, have provided us with a program for years of continuing research.
Over my lifetime, what one felt was an open-ended world. There was masses of stuff to learn. It's changed radically. Unless we realize that we're screwing up. we're going to have a very devastated planet to live on. I'm Frank Talbot. I was born in South Africa and brought up in Cape Town. It was a lovely youth. My mother used to take me to the seaside. I became fascinated by the things that grew in the half-tide pools, the fish particularly. I did reasonably well at school, got into the university, and I did a master's degree there and later a PhD. Applied for a job at the Australian Museum here. And I got the job. After about 6 months, I thought, I'm not going to leave this country. We were so welcomed in Australia. I eventually became director of the Australian Museum, and we worked on a research project to start a research station.
My name's Frank Talbot. I'm interested in the biological problems of coral reef.
I found an American who shared enthusiasm for research and science and went up and found an island.
We chartered a boat and we went out to Lizard Island. It was quite rough on the way, but I'm a bit of a sailor too, so it wasn't a problem. And I cooked the dinner because the captain said it was far too rough to cook. And I said, I'm sorry, we're going to have dinner, because we'd bought some good red wine.
And the American gave us $100,000 to help start.
Between Frank and Henry, the Lizard got established. Well, I was very lucky to be on their very first expedition to Lizard Island with Frank Talbot, and it was fabulous. It was fabulous. It was my first time diving on a reef.
You had to help yourself, and there were cooking tents. Things were supplied, but it was basically fairly primitive, but very functional.
Even in those very early days when we slept in tents and we worked outside, it was all about doing science.
The first 50 years have been extraordinary, and I've been there for 2/3 of them. I worked out the other day. That's massive. It's changed from an island that didn't have any permanent habitation to an island that's now world renowned.
Hundreds of people annually come to this place to work in the reef, working to understand how this ecosystem works. How does it work? What makes it tick?
People learn from each other and pick up things from each other. And at Lizard you could be mixing with someone who's working on sand grains, and someone else is working on current, and someone else is working on the noise profile. And that's one of the marvellous things, is to mix with other people and immerse yourself in science.
Because of the volume of researchers that visit and then the quality of research projects that they host, you would struggle to find another research station in the world that publishes as many scientific research papers per year and ones that are high impact.
Reefs are changing really quickly because of the things that we're doing to the planet, and so that has actually changed the direction of the research quite a bit. Now, there's still an awful amount of basic knowledge that we need to find out about coral reefs, but all those projects now have a twist. Well, okay, we're looking into how this affects that, but how's it going to change with climate change?
Think about this, like in a place like Little Island Research Station, the research has been done for 50 years. And even in such a well-studied place, you can describe new species.
Taxonomy really is the fundamental and the foundation for all conservation work. You cannot conserve something or protect something that you don't know exists. Until you actually put a name to something, that thing is invisible to the world. There's only one home that we live on, and if we don't protect our oceans, who else is going to do it?
Frank retired a long time ago, before I started at the museum, but as a collection manager I get to see who contributed hugely to our understanding of fishes. In terms of his importance, there's 3 species of fishes named after Frank. One of them I did bring to show you. Here we have the holotype of Chrysipptera talboti, which is Talbot's demoiselle. So beautiful little damselfish found not only on the Great Barrier Reef but in the greater Indo-Pacific.
Most scientific studies unfold over a series of days, weeks, or months. What makes a field station like Lizard Island unique is that it draws upon years and even decades of research. And it's hard to come by in the world of science. It's even harder to come by in the richest natural ecosystems that we have on this planet, on rainforests on land and on coral reefs in the ocean. It connects me also to a vision of our past director, Frank Talbot, who did so many incredible things in advancing this museum in his time. Back then, maybe no one thought one of the most important would be the founding in 1973 of the Lizard Island Research Station. He had an incredible vision. He didn't know what would happen there, but he knew if he picked a good place, that that would last, and that would create a legacy of study and data that would allow us to understand the reef better than we'd ever be able to do otherwise.
Change in science has been enormous. We now know what we are doing and what we have done. Communication of science, getting across what science does, what it is, how it can help, that's vital. And the museum plays an enormously good and important role in this. Even perhaps more key than it was when I was young in helping mankind.
Australian Museum scientists and the literally thousands of scientists from around the world who have conducted research on Lizard Island tell the story that Frank Talbot started 50 years ago. But Frank's contribution to marine science in the museum sector goes way beyond the Lizard Island Research Station. Frank is a leader, a mentor and a role model. With a career in universities and museums from the AM to the Cal Academy of Sciences, and then as the director of the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in Washington, DC, Frank has always broken new ground. Australia, the Great Barrier Reef and Lizard Island really owe him. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Talbot Oration, of course, named in honour of the brilliant Frank Talbot. And Frank's sitting down the front here, and he welcomed me with open arms, and I can't tell you what an amazing man he is to this day, to share his experiences and guidance and to be very much part of the Australian Museum still. So thank you, Frank, for that. And I'd like to thank Yvonne Weldon, of course, for her welcome to country this evening as well. Yvonne, you said some really special things there tonight. Of course, we're at a really interesting time in Australia. This is a very important year. Reconciliation Week this week is an important week as well. So it's a time when we all need to think very carefully about the role of our First Nations people and about giving that voice to Parliament. Yes, I think we should. That's my personal view, not the museum's. And wasn't that a terrific film at the beginning, made by our team here at the museum with Butter Media? If you didn't notice, I'm the Sheila at the end there, Kim McKay, Director and CEO of the Australian Museum. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're gathered on tonight, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and of course emerging, and we have many of those emerging leaders working here at the museum. We are, of course, on Gadigal land, land that was never ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge the Dingal and Ngarrindjeri traditional owners of the lands, seas and skies of the Lizard Island region. And we've been working with local communities there on some really interesting archaeological work on middens on Lizard Island. So that will be revealed soon. A special welcome tonight, of course, to former directors and past presidents of the AM, including Frank, Dr. Des Griffin, who's, I think, with us tonight, Sam Mostyn, who you'll hear from, Robin Williams, and current President Brian Hartzer, who you'll hear from soon too. A special welcome to our trustees of the AM, of the Australian Museum Foundation. Dickon Loxton's here, our former president there, and Deputy Chair Fiona Sinclair, welcome. And the Lizard Island Reef Research Foundation are here in force, and I'll talk about them a bit later, and our great donors and supporters who are with us. And particular reference tonight to Katie and Bella, who are our Auslan interpreters for this evening. Now, it's my privilege to welcome all of you to the museum tonight for a special edition of Night at the Museum, the 3rd annual Talbot Oration, Coral Reefs in Hot Water, to be presented by Dr. Anne Hoggett AM. The annual Australian Museum Talbot Oration, of course, is named for Frank, and you heard in the video that he was the director here from 1966 to 1975, went on to be director of the Cal Academy in California, and then director of the Smithsonian Natural History Museum from 1989 to 1994, and whose brilliant legacy includes the founding in 1973 of the AM's Lizard Island Research Station. So tonight we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Lizard Island Research Station, located 270 kilometres north of Cairns at the top of the Great Barrier Reef. Great place to pick, Frank. Yeah, he got that right in the beginning. And the remarkable work that's been generated there over the past half-century, especially under the guidance of Anne and her husband, Dr. Lyle Vail AM, who have been co-directors of Lizard since 1990. What an innings, Anne. The Lizard Island Research Station is part of the Australian Museum Research Institute, or AMRI as we call it, facilitating coral reef research and education on the Great Barrier Reef, one of Australia's greatest natural treasures and a World Heritage Area, and is key to our commitment to transforming the conversation around climate change. Now, my connection to Lizard Island began in my very first week as director of the AM some 9 years ago in April 2014, when Lizard Island had to be evacuated due to Cyclone Ita, a Category 4 cyclone with 158 km/h winds that hit the research station on a Friday afternoon at around 6:30 p.m, I think it was, Anne. The marine research staff, students and visiting scientists had to be evacuated prior to that, helping support an emergency evacuation of scientific staff from a tropical island research station where they're dedicated to their work and don't like leaving it, over 2,000 kilometres away from the museum in central Sydney, was not something I had originally envisioned as part of my first week on the job. There's nothing quite like a Category 4 storm to create an immediate appreciation of the operational responsibilities of this Australia's first museum. And it was the first time in 25 years, I think, that we'd had to evacuate. Thankfully, everyone swiftly and safely moved out of harm's way under Anne and Lyle's expert supervision. Thanks to the support of the Lizard Island Reef Research Foundation, we now have a cyclone shelter on Lizard Island. Now, many trustees of LIRS are with us tonight, including the Chair, Kate Haywood, and Treasurer Charlie Shootram, who are tireless in their efforts to make this research station one of the best facilities in the world. Thank you so much, Kate, Charlie, and the entire team at LIRS for your ongoing support. And I've got to tell you, they have great plans for the future, so if you've got some spare cash in the back pocket tonight, I know Charlie would love to hear from you. Wave, Charlie. Yeah. Anne Hoggett, of course, first visited the Australian Museum's Lizard Island Station in 1982 to collect specimens for the AM, and in 1990 commenced as co-director with Lyle. There was a bit of romance before that and a marriage too that got them both up there together, which was a great solution. Anne specialises in, sorry, I just mispronounced it, echinoderms, starfish, brittle stars, sea urchins and other species. She advances cutting-edge coral reef research, helping young scientists attain their goals in the field and working closely with the Research Foundation, her colleagues here at the Museum Research Institute, now led by our Chief Scientist, Professor Chris Helgen, trying to do the best we possibly can. Now, Anne's insights over 33 years on the impacts of human activity, invasive species and climate change on the reef are hugely important for our ability to protect this vast, precious ecosystem, providing an important longitudinal overview of changes to the Great Barrier Reef. Anne and Lyle have spent the last 3 decades bearing witness to the impact of climate change on our reefs and marine ecosystems. Along with Lyle, she has tracked the devastating effects of threats like cyclones. We had one 2 years after Ita, so, they didn't stop. So the impact of climate change on our reefs and marine ecosystems, coral bleaching, pollution and Crown-of-Thorns starfish outbreaks, all of which Anne will discuss in tonight's Talbot Oration, Coral Reefs in Hot Water. Following Anne's keynote address, she'll be joined for a panel discussion by Australian Museum's Pacifica Collections and Engagement Manager, Melissa Marlou. Welcome, Melissa. Amory ichthyologist, Dr. Joey Di Battista, who's done quite a bit of work up on lizard recently, and sustainability advisor, business leader and former president of the Australian Museum Trust, Sam Mostyn, who will facilitate the discussion. Please join me in welcoming to the stage our orator for 2023, Dr. Anne Hoggett AM, the Australian Museum's co-director of the Lizard Island Research Station. Welcome, Anne.
Wow, big audience. Nice to see you all. Thank you for coming. The video that we saw is just incredible, and it's preempted some of the things that I was going to say, so forgive me if I repeat, but it's all in order here, so I'll start. Well, many of you here are probably well aware that coral reefs are the most amazing places in the world. I need my glasses on. They're incredible biodiversity hotspots. A really famous statistic about coral reefs is that they occupy 0.1 of 1% of the Earth's surface, but they are home to 25% of marine species. That's actually outdone by marine fishes. A more recent statistic is that 37% of named marine fish species live on coral reefs that occupy such a tiny proportion of the world. It's incredible. Coral reefs are a major source of protein for 500 million people. That's a big chunk of the world's population. They mitigate the effects of storms on coastlines by absorbing the strength of big waves that crash onto the shore. And they're tourist magnets that provide many benefits to local communities, social, economic, and cultural. And of course, they're staggeringly beautiful. Can we have the slides up, please? Thank you. Staggeringly beautiful. Okay, Australia's Great Barrier Reef is the largest coral reef system on the planet. It's more than 2,300 kilometres long, and it occupies an area that is larger than Victoria and Tasmania combined. It's a source of pride and joy to many Australians, and it's often in the news, especially since 2016, when coral bleaching occurred globally and caused the world to sit up and take notice. This photo was taken near Lizard Island just a few weeks ago. Reefs don't get any better than this. A huge diversity of corals, high coral cover, and teeming with fish. How do we reconcile this with stories only a few years ago that the Great Barrier Reef is dead or dying? That's my topic for tonight. I'm honoured to present this third annual Talbot Oration in the year that Lizard Island Research Station marks its 50th anniversary. The research station exists to put scientists right on the reef with the facilities they need to understand how it works. It's an hour's flight north of Cairns, and the research station is a small community of scientists who come from all over the world to study how coral reefs work. The station currently enables more than 100 research projects per year, conducted by 400 scientists and their collaborators. This work has produced a vast body of knowledge over the station's 50 years, currently over 2,700 scientific publications. I think it's fair to say that Lizard Island is one of the best studied coral reefs on the planet. As we've heard, the Talbot Oration celebrates the enormous contributions of Frank Talbot, and it was Frank who established the station all those years ago when he was director of the Australian Museum. I'd also like to pay tribute to Des Griffin, who's here tonight, and to the Lizard Island Reef Research Foundation. Des succeeded Frank as director of the Australian Museum when the station was only 2 years old, and he was instrumental in developing it into what it is today. The foundation was established in 1978 when the station was only 5 years old to support research and education there. It has done that brilliantly over the past 45 years. Thank you all. The station started as a series of tents along the beach with a makeshift building for a lab. And thanks to the support of many, many people, it has developed into the world-renowned coral reef research facility that it is today. It provides everything that scientists need to work right on the reef. My husband, Lyle Vail, and I have been joint directors of the research station since 1990. As Kim said, that is 33 years. That is 2/3 of the station's history, which has got to be some sort of record for longevity in a situation like that. We're scientists ourselves, and we're privileged to interact daily with visiting scientists who are at the cutting edge of reef research. This gives us a unique perspective in what's going on coral reefs at a time of great change on reefs globally. So, what is going on? Are reefs dying due to coral bleaching as trumpeted by international media only a few years ago? How does that gel with recent news that coral cover is higher now on the Great Barrier Reef than at any time since long-term monitoring began in 1985? First, we need to understand a few things about corals and coral reefs. Firstly, corals are animals. These coral branches are about as thick as your finger, and each coral animal, or polyp, occupies a little cup in the coral skeleton. The purple bits are the polyp's tentacles. Most of the polyp is concealed within the yellow-green skeleton. The tentacles capture bits of food from the water, and they pass them into the mouth in the centre of the ring of tentacles. The skeleton is built by the polyps as the colony grows. The shapes of coral skeletons are incredibly varied, and they're used to distinguish species. Reefs are built up by the growth of corals on coral skeletons over millennia. Corals have been on Earth for over 400 million years, but they haven't always been in a form that builds reefs. Reefs have come and gone over geological time spans, and the coral animals have reverted to skeletonless forms that just live on rocks and things like that. So they're not always able to build reefs. To build the vast quantity of skeletons needed to build a reef, a lot of energy is needed. And these little coral polyps can't eat enough to produce that amount of energy on the scale required. They do it by living in a symbiotic relationship with tiny plant-like things called zooxanthellae. This is a coral polyp, and the tiny brown specks are the zooxanthellae living inside it. Zooxanthellae photosynthesize just like plants. They use sunlight, carbon dioxide and water to produce food that provides a huge proportion of the coral's nutrition. For many species of corals, it's more than 95%. And it's this relationship that provides the energy that enables these tiny animals to build huge reefs. Okay, so what is coral bleaching? Within the coral animal, there are some very complicated chemical reactions going on, involving both the coral and the zooxanthellae, and these reactions are affected by the environmental conditions. When conditions aren't right, photosynthesis goes into overdrive, and toxins build up inside the coral. So the corals expel the zooxanthellae to slow down the photosynthesis to protect themselves. That's a response that has evolved in corals that protects them from short-term stress. In normal circumstances, it's a good thing. It can be caused by lots of environmental stresses, including temperature outside a fairly narrow range, salinity changes, bright light, and exposure to air. When the zooxanthellae have been ejected, the coral animal is transparent. So when you're looking at a bleached colony, you're looking through clear, living animal tissue at the white skeleton underneath. This is a living coral as it started to bleach during the marine heat wave of 2016. The white bits are where the zooxanthellae have been ejected, and the brown bits still have their zooxanthellae. As the event progresses, corals bleach completely. They're still alive when they're bright white like this, but they're sick and starving, and they can't live for very long in this state. In all cases of mass bleaching, the stress that causes it is water temperature above the normal summertime maximum for a period of weeks, and it's made worse by sunny conditions. Even from this state of fully bleached, if the water cools down quickly enough, the coral can regain its zooxanthellae and survive. But if the heat persists for too long, the coral will die. This bright white stage doesn't last for very long, a period of weeks at most. This coral has bleached completely, and parts of it are dead. The bright white bits are where the coral animals are still alive, and the scuzzy bits are where algae has come in to settle on the dead coral skeleton. This is what the reef looked like at Lizard Island and many other places on the Great Barrier Reef after the mass bleaching event of 2016. Vast areas of dead corals covered with seaweed. So how did we get from this to this in just a few years? There are several mechanisms at work, and there's a lot of research going on about this right now. Let's have a look at them. Most reef-building corals spawn just once a year in a mass event, and that's the only opportunity they have to start new colonies from scratch. On the Great Barrier Reef, it happens in late spring or early summer at night. It's an incredible view that I've been privileged to witness many times. These pink balls are bundles of eggs and sperm, about the size of a pinhead. They float slowly to the surface where they break apart and the eggs are fertilised. They develop into larvae which float at sea for a week or so before settling to the bottom to start a new colony. For a few years after the 2016 bleaching, there was no coral spawning at Lizard Island because there was no basically adult corals left to spawn. But after the bleaching, larvae did settle and form new colonies, so initially they must have drifted in from somewhere else. This photo is from 2018, 2.5 years after the bleaching event, showing an early stage of the recovery. The larger corals are about as big as your fist. They had already settled months before the bleaching, and they were tiny when it happened. By tiny, I mean invisible to the naked eye or up to a couple of centimetres across. As they grew, these little survivors became the first very welcome signs of regeneration. They're at least a year older than these smaller ones. They would have settled in late 2016 or 2017 after the bleaching event. These must have come from larvae spawned elsewhere because there was close to zero spawning at Lizard Island itself in those years. Both of these groups of corals have now grown to very decent sizes, as we saw earlier. Some of the plate corals are more than 1 metre across, and the staghorn corals have branches at least that long. So the third mechanism of regeneration is recovery from incomplete death of a colony. We've seen this mechanism at work on branching corals, but after the big bleaching event, it was most noticeable on the boulder corals. Some of these are massive, several metres in height. This photo shows a small boulder coral soon after the 2016 bleaching event. Most of its polyps have succumbed to bleaching, so the top and sides are covered with seaweed. But some polyps survived at the bottom, probably because they were more shaded there. Over the years, these polyps can bud new ones that recolonise the existing skeleton. This photo shows a much larger colony of the same species that was taken a few weeks ago. You'll have to take my word for it that it had lost most of its polyps too back in 2016. I don't have a photo of it from then, but it has almost totally recovered with just a few bare patches still to be recolonised. New colonies of this size take decades to build from a single larva at the coral spawning, but they can regenerate by growing over existing skeleton much more quickly. So with these three mechanisms all working at the same time, some areas that were comprehensively destroyed in 2016 are looking fabulous now, only 7 years later. But we haven't yet looked at the caveats, and we have to. What are the constraints on these mechanisms being able to work? Firstly, the recovery isn't uniform, it's patchy. This shows the most recent long-term monitoring data at Lizard Island from the Australian Institute of Marine Science. The colours show coral cover, with green being the highest and red the lowest. Only some parts of the outside edges of the island group have recovered to the extent that I showed you earlier, the green bits. Some of these sites haven't shown much sign of recovery at all so far. But the monitoring program doesn't have any sites inside the Lizard Island lagoon, and there's little sign of any recovery there so far. So it's very, very patchy. Secondly, the Great Barrier Reef is a huge interconnected system. Parts of it can be badly damaged, but so far other areas can remain healthy and provide the larvae to reseed damaged areas. That has played a big part in the recovery process. Thirdly, coral recovery depends on other species laying the groundwork. This photo was taken 3 weeks after a cyclone smashed all the corals to rubble, leaving bare rock that was colonised by seaweed. New baby corals can't settle on that. They need a clean, hard surface. Fish that eat plants are very important on reefs. The Great Barrier Reef still has plenty of them, but they're increasingly rare in other parts of the world because they're overfished. This is the same area, less than 2 months later. The seaweed has been eaten by fish, and the surface is now ready to accept coral larvae after the next coral spawning. If these fish weren't there, filling this role, there would be no recruitment of new corals. And finally, we've been lucky. Since 2020, corals have bleached at Lizard Island in each of the 4 most recent summers. This has never happened before. The only reason that corals didn't die en masse in any of those events was because the weather changed in the nick of time. In each of those summers, there was a patch of long, hot, calm, clear weather. Water temperature built up to exceed the corals' temperature tolerances, and they bleached. If those conditions had persisted for even another week or 2, another great dying event would have begun, but it didn't. Clouds rolled in, the wind came up, and the water temperature dropped. Corals regained their zooxanthellae and survived. So the apparent paradox of fabulous recovery from utter disaster isn't really a paradox at all. While recovery is great in some places, it hasn't even started in others. And where the reef has recovered, it depends upon a remote source of larvae to reseed devastated areas and key species that provide important ecosystem functions, plus a big dose of luck in the form of weather. So we clearly can't sit back and think that reefs will always bounce back in the face of huge disturbances. As well as bleaching, coral reefs are suffering from many other stressors. 2 major ones are Crown-of-Thorns Starfish and runoff from land. We'll talk about Crown-of-Thorns in a minute. Runoff from land carries both sediment and nutrients into the reef waters. Sediment can smother reef life and muck up the filter-feeding apparatus of the many filter-feeding animals that live on the reefs. Nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen compounds, they fertilise the sea just as well as they fertilise a farmer's crop. On the reef, they promote plant growth to the extent that seaweeds can take over from corals. Nutrients also enter into the crown-of-thorns debate because they may enable more crown-of-thorns larvae to survive and prolong outbreaks. And there's things like industrial pollution, overfishing, physical damage, and plastic pollution. All of these things can take their toll and reduce the ability of reefs to bounce back from severe disturbances like bleaching and cyclones. Some of the effects of climate change have been predicted for decades and now becoming obvious, and coral reefs are among the first ecosystems to show them. Things are going to get worse and very quickly unless we reduce our carbon emissions enormously very soon. Despite their amazing recovery from devastation caused by global warming, coral reefs are already giving us a preview of what's to come. I'll use Lizard Island as a case study. Okay, 3 kinds of disturbance have caused the most of the death of coral at Lizard Island and the rest of the Great Barrier Reef, as long as we've been studying it. First, we have predation by adult Crown-of-Thorns starfish, which eat living coral tissue. Populations of these large starfish periodically outbreak into huge numbers, which can kill a lot of coral. In this picture, the white parts are where the coral animal has been eaten, leaving bare skeleton, and the brown bits are living coral that has not yet been eaten. Secondly, there's cyclones, which strip corals from the reefs, and finally, there's coral bleaching, as we've seen. So let's have a look at the timing of these big 3 disturbances at Lizard Island over the 50 years that the research station has been in existence. Firstly, Crown-of-Thorns. There have been 3 outbreaks of Crown-of-Thorns in that time. The duration of the first one isn't precise, but records show there were large numbers of starfish present in the late 70s and early 80s. The other 2 outbreaks were much better studied, and I was there to see them. At Lizard Island, outbreaks become noticeable quite suddenly. They last for about 5 years. Then the population crashes, and there's a 10 to 12-year period with relatively low numbers. Okay, looking at cyclones now. They're a fact of life in tropical Australia. At the station, we batten down for one almost every summer. But up until 2014, none were stronger than Category 3, and the station had never had to evacuate before. Most were weaker. And while any cyclone is a serious storm, low-level cyclones don't cause anywhere near the damage that those at Category 4 and Category 5 do. 2 cyclones hit Lizard Island at high Category 4 only 11 months apart in 2014 and 2015, causing enormous damage. Oops, there's the timing. None, and then just 2, one after the other. Now have a look at the timing of bleaching events. The first one ever recorded was in 1982. The next was 20 years later in 2002, then 8 years later in 2010. The massive bleaching event that put all the others into the shade was only 6 years after that, in 2016. And in 2017, the water temperature was just as high as the previous year, and if there had been any corals left to kill, that would also have been a high mortality event at Lizard Island as it was elsewhere on the Great Barrier Reef. After that, there were just 2 years in which there was no bleaching. Ever since 2020, it has happened every single summer. This is terrifying to those of us who love reefs. Every summer is a knife edge. So what can we infer from these things? Well, it's obvious that bleaching events are becoming more frequent, exactly as predicted decades ago, because of global warming. In fact, back-to-back events are happening a lot earlier than was originally predicted. The cyclone data show the random nature of cyclones. There's decades of nothing severe, then a couple in short duration. Does this have a climate change signal? We'll talk about that in a minute. The Crown-of-Thorns timeline suggests a natural pattern in the Lizard Island area, and it might have been going on for millennia. This is a very complex story that's outside the scope of this talk, so we won't go into causes of outbreaks, and we'll concentrate only on the implications for corals. This chart shows the intensity of all cyclones that have affected the Great Barrier Reef between 1971 and 2014. Each circle is a cyclone. The ones at the top are low-level cyclones. The most severe ones are at the bottom. The 3 most intense cyclones in that 43-year period all occurred between 2009 and 2014. But this graph finishes at the end of 2014. The first big cyclone to hit Lizard Island in living memory was in 2014, and it's the last one on that graph. But since then, 2 more high Category 4 cyclones have hit the Great Barrier Reef. Nathan in 2015 at Lizard Island, and Cyclone Debbie smashed the Whitsundays in 2017. So the 5 strongest cyclones in the past 52 years have all occurred in the past 14 years. Ignoring these later cyclones, in the period of this analysis, these 3 cyclones caused what was then the most extreme ecological impact recorded along a huge section of the outer Great Barrier Reef. Coral cover fell to record lows over more than 1,500 kilometres, and the species richness and abundance of fish in the southern 1/3 of the Great Barrier Reef was also really low. Unfortunately, that sad record didn't last for long. It was smashed by the massive coral bleaching events of 2016 and 2017 that caused even greater destruction. Can the increased severity of cyclones in recent years be laid at our door too? Well, the IPCC's latest report states with high confidence, and that's a very high bar, that there will be a higher proportion of intense tropical cyclones and that their peak wind speeds will be greater in a warmer world. So I think we do have to claim that as our fault as well. Okay, what are we doing to help prevent and repair damage on the Great Barrier Reef? For more than a decade, the federal government has been funding a program that culls Crown-of-Thorns starfish to save coral from being eaten. Dedicated vessels take trained crews of divers to manually cull starfish using lethal injection. This is enormously expensive and not terribly efficient because the reef is just so big. A lot of science goes into working out where to send the boats and how long they should stay in any particular area. This undoubtedly does save some corals from being eaten. In normal circumstances, these starfish aren't a threat to reefs on a large scale, but the current situation is far from normal. Reefs can and do recover from starfish outbreaks, but with all the other emerging dangers to reefs, culling these starfish is a stopgap means of saving some corals in the short term. Crown-of-Thorns starfish are really the low-hanging fruit when it comes to protecting corals. It's a lot easier to kill starfish than it is to reverse global warming. Even so, a lot of effort is going into finding ways to help reefs in the face of climate challenges. These are multi-pronged programs by many institutions, and they're focused on three main areas. Firstly, they're trying to find ways to prevent bleaching by reducing light intensity and keeping the water temperature within a livable range. This includes things like seeding clouds with water droplets to shade the reef generally, using shading corals directly with shade cloth, as is being done here, and bringing up cooler water from depth to reduce the temperature at the surface where the corals live. Then there's work underway helping corals adapt to higher temperatures. Some projects are selectively breeding corals to create a strain that's more resistant to higher temperatures. Others are changing the type of zooxanthellae within the corals to more heat-tolerant forms, and others are editing corals' genes directly. Finally, there's a lot of effort going into finding ways to restore degraded reefs. These programs include transplanting corals from one place to another, fragmenting corals and growing them up to create more colonies, and taking advantage of the annual coral spawning by collecting the spawn, growing the larvae in floating pools, as you see here, and releasing the larvae at chosen places when they're ready to settle. It's important to understand that these are really last-ditch stands to help reefs survive in the hope that we can bring our carbon emissions down quickly enough. There's substantial heating locked into the system already, so temperatures are going to keep increasing for decades, even if we could decarbonise our society tomorrow. These interventions are focused on keeping at least some of the diversity of corals alive and functioning until we get our climate act together. The researchers working on these projects recognise that. I don't know of any who see their work as a long-term solution. All of these interventions are at a very early stage of development. Some will fail at the experimental stage. Those that can be made to work on a small scale will face immense challenges, scaling up to the size required to make a real difference on the massive reef. But we can't not try. There's too much to lose. Ocean acidification is another consequence of climate change that will affect coral reefs. More carbon dioxide in the air changes the water chemistry, and that affects marine life. The effects of ocean acidification aren't noticeable yet, but they will be in coming decades, just as coral bleaching has our attention now. Climate change is undoubtedly the major threat to coral reefs. Water quality issues caused by runoff from land and other things like that are important too, and they must be addressed. But unless we also get carbon emissions under control, those efforts will be largely useless. As we've seen, some parts of the reef have recovered from severe disturbances that began 9 years ago at Lizard Island with Cyclone Ita. But other large areas haven't even begun to regenerate. So overall, the recovery is far from complete. And this has happened in the best of all possible circumstances, with a vast, intact ecosystem ready to kick into action and with a lot of luck thrown in. Reefs can't continue to bounce back like this if they're hit with major disturbance every year or two. There just isn't time to recover, and yet we're on that exact trajectory. The next 5-year period is predicted to be the warmest on record, and it will include a new record for the warmest year on record ever. That's with 98% certainty, according to the World Meteorological Organization. And that's on top of the past 8 years, which have been the warmest on record so far. As Australians, we have a real responsibility to be leading the charge on climate change, to benefit coral reefs and for a whole host of other reasons. Australia is in a unique position as the custodian of the largest reef system on Earth and another one on its western coast at Ningaloo. Both of those places are listed as World Heritage Areas for their outstanding universal values. We have committed to the world that we will look after them. And we're a rich nation with strong scientific expertise and untapped opportunity to reap the rewards of a renewables revolution. So if not us, then who? We need to think back big and act bravely. Government has a huge role in this, and the government gets its power from us, so we need to make our voices heard. First priority is greater action on climate change, and urgently. We have wasted decades. Large contiguous marine parks are also hugely important. They support the resilience of reefs by retaining biodiversity and hence a functioning ecosystem. Finally, we can all do things to minimise our carbon footprint at a personal and local scale. There are many well-known ways that we can change our own lives to make a difference, and more are being discovered and developed all the time. The Australian Museum has great programs for people who want to learn about these things. While some parts of the reef provide scenes like this, we can't expect them to stay that way or to be able to recover from repeated disturbances at short intervals into the future. There is still a chance to reduce global emissions in time to retain a semblance of reefs as we know them by the end of the century, but it's beyond urgent and we need to get much more serious about it very quickly. We can't rely on reef restoration and adaptation to save coral reefs. They won't. They might help us to keep them going until we get the Earth into better shape for them. Reefs are too important and too beautiful to lose. We need to pull out all stops to keep them. That's it from me.
Oh, thank you, Anne. I'm Brian Hartzer. I'm the chairman of the Board of Trustees at the museum. Anne, that was fantastic. One of the things that I always say to people about the museum is every time I come here, I learn something, and that was certainly true tonight. Anne, that was fantastic, and I understand the problem so much better than I did before. It was incredibly compelling. I'm sure we'd all agree. So very, very well done. Now, you heard a bit from Kim and from Anne about her story at the Lizard Island Research Foundation and the incredible history that you've had there with your husband, Lyle, and I guess your son as well, Dr. Alex Vail, who grew up on the reef effectively, is a marine biologist and a wildlife cameraman who's worked with Sir David Attenborough and the BBC. It's an incredible legacy that you've brought there. And as a little surprise, one of the things that the Australian Museum Research Institute does every year is award a Lifetime Achievement Award to someone who's made a significant contribution to science and the communication of science in particular. And I'm pleased to announce that you and Lyle have won that for this year. So congratulations. There'll be a special event to officially give you that in the near future, but very, very well deserved. Chris Helgen, the chief scientist of the museum, has given me a great summary, I think, which is that Anne and Lyle have been integral to the transformation of the Lizard Island Research Station from an uninhabited corner of Lizard Island to one of the world's best tropical marine field research stations. The work they've done, especially during the past decade of major global change, has been critical for helping the world understand the effects of climate change on the reef. I think it's a terrific summary. And just to finish things off, we have a special message from Tanya Pilbrisek, the Federal Minister for the Environment and Water, who wanted to share some thoughts with you and couldn't be with us tonight. So, to the Minister.
Hi everyone, it's Tanya Plibersek here, Australia's Minister for the Environment and Water. I really wish I could be there in person to celebrate 50 years of science at the Lizard Island Research Station, but I'm in Canberra for Parliament this week. I want to congratulate Dr. Anne Hoggett and Dr. Lyle Vail for their Lifetime Achievement Awards. Anne and Lyle have spent 3 decades studying the impact of climate change on the marine ecosystems at Lizard Island. They've seen it up close, just how devastating coral bleaching, water pollution and invasive species can be to our beautiful reefs and islands. They understand the urgency of our position. The situation is serious, but there is hope if we act now. That's why our government has passed legislation to cut Australia's emissions and why we've put this country on a clear path to net zero. It's why we're doubling the number of renewable energy projects being approved. It's why, in our recent budget, we also doubled the funding going to Australia's Institute of Marine Science. And it's why we're investing more than $1.2 billion to protect and restore the Great Barrier Reef. That money's going to improving water quality, removing marine plastics, controlling invasive species, helping traditional owners manage their sea country, and providing extra help for our marine scientists. We all want to make sure that the beauty and the majesty of the reef can be enjoyed by future generations, and we can only do that with the help and expertise of our scientists. So once again, congratulations Dr. Anne Hoggett and Dr. Lyle Vail on your awards. And congratulations too to Professor Frank Talbot for having the vision to establish the Australian Museum's Lizard Island Reef Research Station 50 years ago. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Minister. And again, Anne, thank you so much for a fantastic oration. We really, really enjoyed it. It was fantastic. Kim, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. And Anne and Lyle didn't know that that was going to happen tonight. So it's always good to surprise people, especially after you gave such a stellar speech, Anne, and really motivated us. Thank you, Brian, too, and also to Minister Plibersek for her support. Tanya, of course, is our local federal member and a regular visitor to the Australian Museum. But especially congratulations to Doctors Anne Hoggett and Lyle Vail for being the recipients of the Amory Lifetime Achievement Award this year. And as Brian said, there are more celebrations planned, so get the frock out. Not Lyle, it's okay, just you, or if he wants, you know. So now it's time for tonight's panel discussion. Anne is joined up here by the Australian Museum's Pacifica Collections and Engagement Manager, Melissa Malu. Mel, if you want to come up. Amory ichthyologist, Dr. Joey Di Battista, who is with us tonight, who's done work up on Lizard Island recently, and sustainability advisor and former president of the Australian Museum Trust, Sam Mostyn AO. So over to you, Sam Mostyn. Thank you.
Welcome everyone after hearing that wonderful oration from Anne. I think we're all just so privileged to have heard you speak. I could listen to you all night. I think it's wonderful that you've come south from your beautiful tropical home to share yours and Lyle's experience, and it is a real honour to be here. And it's always wonderful to come back to the Australian Museum. The faces in the audience are people who've been around this institution for such a long time. Thank you for your beautiful remarks tonight. Thank you. I'm going to give you a little rest and start with Joey. We saw you on the video at the very beginning, and you've worked in the waters around Sydney for a very, very long time with your specialty. Have you been noticing changes to the water here in Sydney? What's the tropicalisation of water doing to the environment that you know so well down here?
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And can everyone hear me? No, my mic's off.
I think use your mic.
How about now? That's good? Okay, perfect. Thanks for that. So just to qualify my answer, I'm a relatively new transplant to Sydney. I'm originally Canadian, so I've been here about 5.5, 6 years now. And so there's lots of things going on in the waters here that are more recent kind of phenomena. And one of the things you alluded to is this tropicalization effect. So these are essentially the warming of waters where we live and where we swim that are increasing in frequency. So Eastern Australia is actually known as a marine climate change hotspot. So the waters adjacent to Sydney are warming at a rate that is faster in other places in the world. And we're actually starting to see the arrival of a lot of new tropical things into Sydney. So my specialty is the study of fishes. So we're starting to see the arrival of more and more tropical fishes that not only come here as larvae and juveniles, but they are now starting to overwinter and form these self-sustaining breeding populations here as well. We've also seen the arrival of a subtropical coral species in Sydney, just outside of Sydney Harbour, outside of Cabbage Tree Bay. You can actually go on a dive now, scuba dive, and dive with a subtropical coral species. And these new species that arrive, such as habitat-forming species like a coral, bring new niches that can allow a lot of these tropical communities to sustain going forward. There's lots of winners and losers when it comes to tropicalization, so it'd be great to be able to dive with tropical fishes and corals here in Sydney. I'm sure that'll be good for the dive industry and the snorkeling industry. But it also means the replacement of some of our resident species as well, either through competition or through the increasing temperatures. And so a lot of the habitat forming algae that we see along our coastline will start to disappear, and a lot of the animals that associate with it. So we are starting to see a lot more changes, and those changes will increase in frequency and scope in the coming years.
Thanks, Joy. Mel, if I can come to you. The statement, The Heart of the Reef, the Healing Country statement by the Great Barrier Reef custodians, could you give us your unique insight into what that means from a Pacific Island perspective?
Interesting. All right, I'll use this. It works. Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the Barrier Reef who put so eloquently and beautifully the document that you had, the Healing Country statement, and it really reflects the values, the relationship and the connection that First Nations people have with country. And I think that is something that's also shared across the Pacific. I'm speaking to you not as someone who is an expert in this area, but we are opening up our new Pacific Gallery in October. Part of what is going to be featured there, thanks to the MacDoc Foundation, is about climate change. And we've done some consultation with people who are actually living through the effects of climate change. And one of the things where we've been informed by a little island in the Solomon Islands, quite remote, that one of the effects is education. And when the consultant or a collaborator told me that, I said, how? And he said, because the kids are coming to school hungry, because the reefs are no longer the same and their families cannot fish there. They don't know the oceans. Their crops have to be planted further inland, so that affects them. So kids are coming to school hungry, and that affects their education. Even the toilets, because of climate change, they have to run about 200, 300 meters, and it keeps moving, is what they've told us. So that's one of the effects that we hear, and also just the relocation of villages that are down near the coastal areas.
We don't really understand those effects, and what you've just described, that the education system and the education of young children can be dislodged because of these impacts. This reminds us about the extraordinary changes that are going on around us. And I'll come back to you in a moment to talk about one of the exhibitions here at the museum that you're leading. Anne, there are just so many things that we could talk about that you raised in your oration tonight, but I was really, my interest was really piqued when you just happened to mention that we should all support marine parks. What do you mean by that? Tell us all about marine parks.
Can I talk to you through this? No. Okay, we'll talk through this. Can you hear me? Excellent. Okay, well, the Great Barrier Reef is managed by the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, which is doing a fabulous job in the face of really difficult circumstances. Marine parks are fantastic because they keep the biodiversity alive. Honestly, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is zoned for different uses, and 33% of it is zoned for no take. So you can't catch fish, you can't collect shells or do anything in those places. The difference between those green zones and the rest of the marine park is quite incredible. We had up at Lizard Island some kids from Cooktown, which is the nearest town to Lizard Island, and out of Cooktown it's blue zone. You're allowed to go fishing, and all these kids were used to going fishing and snorkelling with their families. They came to Lizard Island, they jumped in the water, their eyes were as big as saucers, saying, look at the coral trout. They just have the fish in these green zones that they just don't have in the blue zone. So it's fantastic. And the aspiration to have 33% of our oceans in protected areas is a fantastic thing. But coming back to Cabbage Tree Bay, Joey, I'm a Sydney girl. I grew up here in Sydney. And in my teens and early 20s, before I moved to the tropics, I would go snorkelling at Cabbage Tree Bay, which at that time was fabulous. We loved it. I go snorkelling in Cabbage Tree Bay now, and I'm blown out of the water. The things that you can see there are just incredible. Just a few days ago, there were giant cuttlefish there. Species of sharks that it's incredible. It is rich, alive. You should go there if you live in Sydney. Go to Cabbage Tree Bay. It's just amazing. But that is because it has become a protected area. I think it's about 20 years it's been protected, and it's come back from it was pretty poor before, and it's just amazing now. So marine parks are really important.
So you gave us 3 tasks tonight, which ensuring we have many, many more marine parks and support them was one of your key asks of all of us. So I'm sure that many in the audience will follow up with that. Joey, if I could ask you a little bit about what you see changing with the impact of citizen science and the projects around the areas that you look at, and maybe to encourage our audience to understand a bit more about what citizen science can do and what you're seeing already.
Sure, absolutely. I will second what you just said about marine parks before I dovetail into that, because it does relate to that as well. There is a global initiative at the moment, which is pretty easy to remember. It's 30 by 30. So there's a big push to conserve 30% of our oceans by area and by the year 2030 and create these marine sanctuaries or no-take marine parks. And I think we can do our own part by making that push within our state as well and getting involved in a lot of those projects that center on that. So we've been fortunate enough in the last year to get some seed funding from, it's an NGO based out of Bondi known as Blue World. And this is through their Valerie Taylor Ocean Protection Prizes that they offer each year. They're offering them again this year. So if anyone has great projects based around communication and ocean conservancy, they're actually enlisting new applications. And so they essentially gave us funding to increase biodiversity records from, I guess, underrepresented parts of Sydney Harbour. So we've made a big push to get everyday citizens into the water to take photos of anything that they see, plant or animal, and to post these online. And essentially those become a permanent record for that particular plant or animal at that given point in time. So we've had a big push in southern Sydney Harbour, so places like Parsley Bay and Camp Cove and Shark Beach. When we had a look last year for biodiversity records around Sydney Harbour and our coast, there's actually an order of magnitude greater representation in northern Sydney Harbour and places like Cabbage Tree Bay, precisely because they're now well-protected aquatic reserves that have amazing marine life. And I think we really need to extend that push to other bits of our coastline, including other parts of Sydney Harbour. So it's been a great journey, and people can get involved by going online and searching for this project. It's under the iNaturalist platform, which is probably the biggest online citizen science platform in the world. And essentially, we're enlisting everyday citizens to get in the water and to take photos of beautiful fishes and any other marine animals that they may see.
Brilliant. Now, Mel, I mentioned that there's something happening here at the museum, and in the Pacific Galleries, you've got a focused area on climate change. Maybe you could share with the audience a little bit about that exhibition and again, the kind of stories that people can expect to see there.
Yeah, so we're really excited to tell story directly from the people who are affected by climate change in the Pacific. We have a big installation film that'll be there, and then we'll have some interviews around and information about the different stories. And they've been really heartbreaking, really, to hear about it. I think I grew up in the islands in Tonga, and then coming out here, it's like, oh yeah, well, the sea was always rising a little bit, and not taking it seriously. And then you hear stories like villages in Fiji, our Fijian contributor to the gallery, saying that when they relocated one of the villages, and this village had the healing power or the healing mana of massaging or fixing fractures. And when they had to relocate from their coastal villages inland, they lost that, and it was connected to land. And, you know, I asked because, you know, there have been documentaries and that of cemeteries being underwater. And I know in the Tongan custom that usually there's a custom thing that would dig it up and then bury it elsewhere. And so I asked him, is that being done? And he said, unfortunately not. So it really broke my heart to hear that. And then, you know, just thinking and reflecting, I think last year everybody was aware of the Hunga Ha'apai volcano that happened in Tonga. And for almost 2 weeks, there was no communication whatsoever to Tonga. And it kind of hit most of us thinking, wow, if our islands were to go under, this is the feeling we'd have. Does it still exist? Where do I belong to? Where do I come from? So these are like real hard-hitting stories that we'll be telling in the gallery. And I think another thing is that from the example in Solomon Islands, the feedback to us is that, you know, there's a lot of talk about going back to traditional ways of doing things, but for them, the traditional ways no longer work because it's a new land and it is a new ocean. And for them, it's being educated a bit more and understanding these impacts so that they're able to put in some practices and that'll help them just merely survive. Because, you know, it's the access to food, the reefs, and of course the crops. And then because they can't access that, then there's a huge importation of rice in that, which isn't too healthy for them. So it's this whole effect, and we hope to visit, you know, most of that in the gallery.
Well, I'm sure we would love to have people here tonight, making sure they come and see that wonderful exhibition. Now, I'm going to ask Anne one last question before we go to you, and the microphones have just appeared, so if you've got a question and would like to get ready, I'd ask you to keep your questions short. We only have about 10 minutes of questions with you, and so we can get as much from our panel as possible. So I'll watch for you to line up, but I'm going to ask Anne just one last question personally, and I just wondered how it does feel for you after all this time to be, you're showing us something that I hadn't realised. I didn't realise the life within that coral skeleton. I hadn't realised the role of seaweed, and we hear of seaweed being actually a climate warrior, but there it was actually covering those poor bleached skeletons. Just share a bit more with us about how this coral has taken you to places and what it means to you to actually be so invested in the survival of coral.
It's my whole life, really. It's, you know, most of my adult life has been spent there, and I love it. It's, you know, it's just the most beautiful place, and the most interesting people come to visit us, and it feels worthwhile, the work that's being done up there. And so when these dreadful things have happened, you know, the first feeling is terrible sadness, but it quickly turns to anger because it's, you know, it's our fault. You know, we need to do something about it, and we're not. You know, I think things are improving, but we've got to really get moving. It's really, really urgent.
You mentioned in passing that you've seen many of the spawning events. Could you just give us a tiny taste of what that's like to see that event as it happens annually?
It's incredible. First, you have to pick the night because it happens about between 9 and 11 o'clock at night. And so, you know, if the weather's great, it's easy. If the weather's not great, it's a real chore to get out there in the dark. And so you get to the place and navigate there, and you have to set things up beforehand with lights to make sure you can find the place. And then you jump in, and if it has already started, you see plenty of spawn in the water, and it becomes lost my thing. And then the worms come in, lots of little worms come in, and lots of other things are spawning as well as the coral at the same time. And it becomes so thick that it gets into your ears, and if you're wearing a hood, it gets into your hood, gets down your wetsuit. You get out and you really need a shower. It's incredible. It's the most amazing experience.
Well, thank you. That's just a little touch of what you experienced, and your words tonight were just so beautiful. I think it's made us all want to explore your work even further. We're going to go to the first question. So the gentleman over here.
Thank you very much.
You might just have to shout as well.
I just want to follow up with what Dr. Baptista said. As validated by what you said in the Australian Museum Citizen Science Project, Australia Asia Fishes, indicates that there is a migration of tropical fish coming south. Is there any indication that the reef itself may be coming south as well? And if that's the case, what should we be doing now to prepare the fields, to prepare the environment for this possible migration of the reef further south?
Hello? Yep. Yeah, thanks for your question. Yeah, you are right, absolutely, and that's one of the biggest, I guess, powers of these citizen science projects is that particularly Australasian Fishes has identified all these new tropical fishes that are showing up in places where they weren't found before, and really without the help of citizens, we wouldn't have seen these, or maybe it would have taken many more years of researchers getting out, just because citizens get to more places more often and see these things and photograph them and document them. In terms of how quick these changes will happen, I think it's a time will tell story. So there's some parts of the world that have undergone this tropicalization process quite quickly. So if you look at some of the areas in southern Japan, within 20 years, they've actually completely shifted from a kelp algal-dominated ecosystem to a coral-dominated ecosystem. If you look at the photos, it's actually quite striking. Whereas here in Sydney, we have had the arrival of tropical fishes and some corals, but we haven't yet seen that phase shift here. And so I think in terms of the timeline for these things happening, it's kind of a time will tell story, and there's lots of active research programs looking at this at the moment. So stay tuned to that space, I'd say.
A question for both you and Joey, I think. You mentioned, Anne, that there's a critical temperature at which the reef starts to bleach. It's sort of a tipping point, I suppose. So this is a question about tipping points. What is that temperature, and what other tipping points can we foresee that we have to watch out for? What awaits us in terms of these tipping points that will cause sudden changes in the, hopefully not with the decline of the reef?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, the tipping point in terms of temperature for corals is very local. So the corals in any particular area are adapted to the normal summertime maximum that they find in that area. At Lizard Island, our normal summertime maximum is about 29.5 degrees, and if the temperature exceeds that for a period of weeks, the corals will start to bleach. There's a concept of degree heating week, so 1 degree in addition to the normal summertime maximum for 1 week is 1 degree heating week. You start to see bleaching if there's 4 degree heating weeks, and you get mass bleaching in excess of 8 heating weeks. So if we had 31.5 degrees, 2 degrees higher than normal, and that lasted for 4 weeks, that would be 8 degree heating weeks, and we would get mass bleaching. In 2016, I think we had 16 degree heating weeks. So, you know, it was way above anything. It was out of this world. In terms of other tipping points, I guess with the climate change, it will be the ocean acidification. It's a very complex chemical study that needs to be done. At Lizard Island, some very forward-thinking people studied reef metabolism back in the 1970s, and that has been incredibly fortuitous because now we have a baseline. And if we hadn't had that baseline, you know, we wouldn't know what we were talking about. But people have been coming back to Lizard Island in recent years and redoing these metabolism studies because the reef actually acts like an organism. It respires, it grows, and so, you know, they can measure these things. It's very complicated. There's academic discussion about it. We don't have an answer yet, but I think ocean acidification will be another tipping point in the future.
Hi, my name is Betty. I'm studying environmental science at UNE. So I found this super interesting, so thank you for having it, and congratulations on your award. One of the things that we talked about during my degree was, and it pops up quite a lot actually, is the gap that seems to be between the research that you guys are doing, but all that knowledge that you're gathering, the gap between that and it being actively implemented on like a government scale or a policy scale, and I'd just like to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess we're in the group of people who gets the information and puts it out there, and it's up to other people to use that information. I guess, you know, other parts of the museum here assist in that, but the researchers are too busy doing their research to be really, you know, working with government. There's plenty of government interaction with scientists and things, but I do agree there's a bit of a gap there. Yeah.
You know, because you've been doing it for so long, you know, the sort of support you can get and you've seen it implemented in the sort of
Certainly, you know, science is used, you know, in terms of, you know, fisheries and no-take zones, and, you know, if we didn't know about the biology of fishes, you wouldn't know how to protect fishes properly. That's really basic science, and there's still plenty of species that are extracted in reef areas that we don't know anything about because just nobody's done the work. It's a vast topic. Coral reef science is actually very young. It really only started in the 60s when, you know, as scuba diving became widely available and people actually got out onto reefs. Before that, it was all done by dredgers from ships, and everything came up mangled, and, you know, you knew nothing about the living animals. So very young science, still a huge field to discover. But I agree, there is a gap with what we know and how it's implemented in policy.
Thanks for that question. I think it was important that we heard from the Minister for Environment tonight, and the Minister for Climate Change. We have a reimagined climate change authority and things that are happening again. So I think maybe science is back on the agenda at the federal level, I think probably at the states, across the states as well. We can only hope so. Now, I'm going to come over here and we have a youngest member of the audience asking a question.
To hold it right in your mouth.
How can you start working at Lizard Island?
Okay, you need to do well at school, study science and maths, then go to university and study marine science or even zoology or botany, any of the biological sciences, even geology you could do. But yeah, learn the sciences and become well qualified and get out there and talk to people, volunteer, just get involved with things. I was very lucky. I'm still there. You have to wait until I go, until the next person gets the opportunity.
That you do have people visit, so families can visit. I think through programs at the museum, it's possible to visit Lizard Island before you go back as a scientist, perhaps, or take over Anne's job.
Yeah, we have student groups who come to Lizard Island. Some schools run trips for their own students, and we are currently running a trip that's available to all students in New South Wales. So it's a great thing to come to Lizard Island on a field trip to learn the life of a marine scientist.
I think you might be talking to your mum and dad about a future trip. Thank you. Thank you. Now over here.
Thanks, Anne. I don't agree with that last question. I just have a question about Lizard Island and the other remote research stations that are on the Great Barrier Reef. Obviously, Lizard Island's only one of a handful of research stations. I had the pleasure of working on Orpheus Island as well, as a student at JCU, but I've also visited Heron Island with my parents in it. But really, there's only a handful of those research stations. Do you foresee any big expansions being made to the amount of these remote research stations we see, which are right on the reef? Obviously, with all this money that the new government is implementing to save the environment, there's got to be some kind of expansion made. I know AIMS, the CSIM Institute the CSIM facility is also being expanded. In terms of these remote research stations, what do you see for the future of Lizard Island and Orpheus Island?
Yeah, well, there are 4 main research stations on the Barrier Reef. With Frank Talbot started 2 of them. At One Tree Island, which is run by the University of Sydney, and it's not far from Heron Island, run by the University of Queensland, and Orpheus Island, run by James Cook University. So there's a good spread, Orpheus Island's sort of in the middle and Lizard Island's in the north and the 2 further ones in the south. There's also one at Moreton Bay, just outside the Great Barrier Reef. There's a new entrant into the coral reef research stations on the western coast. The Minderoo Foundation has set up a new marine research station at Exmouth, which is really great, and we're entering into agreements to work with them and to foster relationships between research in the Indian Ocean and on the east coast. So I think Australia is pretty well served by its 4 research stations. It's not the least bit easy to run a research station or to establish a new research station. I think we've probably got enough, but the ones that we have need to be properly resourced, as Lizard Island is. We're very lucky with the support that we have, but I think that their value is recognised, and if we can keep the ones that we've got going, I think we're doing well.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And we'll have one last question. We're just on 8 o'clock. We don't want to keep it here too late, but please, your question.
Yeah. With your fabulous perspectives, I'd love to know what are your suggestions for how each of us can build a stronger personal relationship to sea country here in Sydney.
So perhaps you can answer that.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at that. So I think my main, push would be for to get people more engaged with the water around them and all the marine organisms in those waterways. And one of the biggest ways that people can get involved is through citizen science projects. Not just the one I mentioned, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on around Sydney and New South Wales that you can dig into and really find something that suits your interests and I guess your time commitments that you can make to a project like that. And not just getting in the water. Maybe that's not something that's available to you. There's lots of online forums that you can look at photos and identify things. So there's lots of ways to be involved with citizen science. And then also, I really push people to get involved with a lot of these local ocean conservancies that are doing really great work at petitioning to either governments or funding councils to increase marine protection around our country. They're doing a lot of great work, but they do need support from everyday people, and they're often great groups of people that are like-minded, very educated, and very interested in protecting what we have around the country. So I encourage people to get involved in those types of initiatives if they have time to do that.
Mel, do you have any last remarks?
I think from a Indigenous Pacifica perspective, and I'm pretty sure I'm in agreement with sort of the First Nations view on it, especially with the statement of country that you mentioned earlier on, is having that appreciation and respect for, I know it sounds so simple, but reading that and understanding the value that they have for land, for the ocean. There are traditional ways that we look after it. Some may not work now, but understanding and being in touch with that and understanding there's other perspectives as well.
I really thank you all for coming and for paying such close attention. It's wonderful. A really heartfelt plea to all of you to take care of our oceans, and particularly our coral reefs. It's urgent, it's dire. We need everybody to speak up. I really think the best thing that we can do is to make our voices heard with government. I mean, the small things that we can all do at home, they're great, they're not enough. Okay, we need to make people aware at the highest levels, and I think we've got a government now who's listening. We want them to have a lot of our support so that they know they're on the right track.
Kim to come and say a few words. I remember actually Tim Flannery, when Tim gave the first Talbot Oration a few years ago, one of the questions from the audience was, what else can we do in addition to the things you've asked? And just strangely, as time would have it, this morning I was in a conversation at a superannuation fund that I'm involved with, where the fund wants to invest in companies that are decarbonising fast and wants to do that on behalf of the members of the fund. But often, companies that are doing that are not rated well by the market. So they're not as great investments as those that are continuing to pollute and continuing to use carbon. And so one of the things that I think we've got to think about as owners of capital and owners of our super funds is how much do we want to give up on some of our return to make sure that the investments are made in the companies that are actually doing the hard work to make sure that there is a rapid decarbonisation that is one of the only ways we can protect our oceans. And we're not having those kind of conversations, I suspect, directly as people who own superannuation funds and think about the impact on return. We're still in a world where capital wins, and yet we know we've got to break that system, and for all the reasons you've given us tonight. So we do all have a form of power and an opportunity to speak about our own direct connection with the environment. So thank you for inspiring us tonight. I'm not going to thank our panel because that's the job of Kim. And as Kim comes up, I just want to let you know that Kim's middle name is Coral. And if you want to find her on Twitter, you'll see her at Kim Coral. And so I think she's absolutely the right person to bring this night for us. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you so much, Sam and Joey and Melissa, for that great and engaging discussion tonight. I just want to say one other thing about Sydney Harbour. It's very dear and close to my heart, having co-founded Clean Up Australia and doing that first clean up of Sydney Harbour back in January 1989. And now, of course, there's the Sydney Institute of Marine Science, which Frank Talbot also created. This man never gives up, and he's a great example, therefore, to all of us, because SIMS is doing some great work around protecting and preserving Sydney Harbour as well. So that's another legacy that Frank is leaving us. So I do want to point out tonight that the Talbot Oration is a program of the Australian Museum's Climate Solutions Centre and is supported by ICS, International Conservation Services, run by Julian Bickersteth and his team. So thank you, Julian, for your support for this. ICS is also supporting a series of day-long seminars for small museums across the state in conjunction with the Australian Museum. And the curator of the Australian Museum's Climate Change Centre, Dr. Jenny Mule, and our sustainability champion here at the museum, Zara Ahmed, will run those seminars. We're thrilled to have ICS's support to be able to do that over the next 2 years. So it's a really big part of the global commitment of museums to reduce our footprints and to make a difference ourselves. You know, you've got to start somewhere, and starting at home and at work is a good place. And so thank you, Julie, for your leadership there in supporting us, but also many decades you've worked in this space trying to get museums around the world at the cutting edge of this, so thank you very much. Our Climate Solutions Centre creates research-based exhibitions, programs and resources for the community and New South Wales and beyond. It includes raising awareness of solutions, sharing powerful stories. Well, we heard that tonight for sure, and empowering people to take action, which is exactly what Anne has done for us all tonight. There are many other ways you can engage in the climate conversation, and our upcoming Eureka Talk series featuring the winners and finalists, the Australian Museum Eureka Prizes Awards, begins next Saturday, the 10th of June, with Professor Veena Sajwala in conversation with Dr. Jackson Ryan as they discuss the science of decarbonising the world. I'll be there at that. Now, Veena is a rock star in the world of environmental inventions, and a few years ago was named New South Wales Australian of the Year. Of course, Tim Flannery, as Sam mentioned, gave our first Talbot Oration, who was Australian of the Year, and he's back at the Australian Museum, we're thrilled to say, with a great tan from Greece. Tim, you look far too relaxed. Veena, of course, is literally exploring a way that we can replace the need for coal and coke in steel manufacturing by using spent coffee grounds. Now that is so wonderful to hear and justifies my 2 coffees every morning. So we've got some great people who work with the Australian Museum and who are doing cutting-edge, world-leading research. And so please support them and come and hear them. Now, tonight's Talbot Oration is also presented with support from the New South Wales Government as part of our Culture Up Late program. And I want to thank the Department Secretary, Elizabeth Mildwater, for joining us tonight and seeing some of that in action. The AM stays open late until 9 p.m. every Wednesday night. Next Wednesday, June 7, our partnership with Vivid Sydney begins with a sold-out talk on what we can learn from nature, featuring, among others, photographer and artist Sarah Jeffries. We hope to see you there, and I hope there's wait list because I just said it was sold out. But it'll be great. Regardless, come along. We're open with music and drinks and a chance to see our exhibitions at night without big crowds. And it's a great date night, no matter how old you are. So come on in. And also next week we'll be opening a really beautiful exhibition our award-winning team has created called BLAS, which in the Papua New Guinea Highlands language means body adornment. And it is a spectacular exhibition. It will be down in our touring hall. There's a small fee that applies to go to that, but I can highly recommend it to you. It is breathtaking. We worked with communities in the Broken Highlands to create really brilliant headdresses that reflect their community and culture, as well as from our Pacifica collection, which has over 65,000 objects in it, one of the finest in the world. So it'll be a spectacular exhibition on for a few months. So come back to that. But importantly to all of you, thank you for coming along tonight. I know you really enjoyed Anne's oration and the panel discussion. Thank you again, Sam. And avoid to continue to engage in this conversation. We'll be posting the oration and panel discussion on our website for future reference. But now, ladies and gentlemen, the bar is open and it's time for a responsible drink. Thank you all for coming.